Millionaire arrived home earlier than usual and heard his wife say, "I already put poison in his glass. In one day he will be dead." Hours later, the millionaire decided to switch the glasses, and everyone was shocked by what happened. The city's sun was already shining through the enormous windows of the Lockwood mansion when Beatrice Aldridge de Lockwood decided to have her breakfast. The golden light crossed the white linen curtains, casting delicate shadows on the carved wooden furniture that adorned the adjacent living room. At 75 years old, the family matriarch still maintained an elegant posture, a reflection of the years when she was one of the great ladies of Mexican society. Her silver hair, always impeccably arranged in a low bun, matched the light blue silk ensemble she wore that morning, carefully ironed by the housekeeper. Her hands, marked by time but still graceful, trembled slightly as she held the English porcelain cup, adorned with golden details and small blue flowers. Beatrice tried to ignore the knot that formed in her stomach every time she had to face another day in that house, which, although it had been hers for over 50 years, now seemed a minefield of tensions and unspoken fears. In the immense kitchen, which looked like it came straight out of an architecture magazine, the Italian marble floor shone in the sunlight, reflecting the luxury that permeated every corner of that house. The black granite counters were polished to the point of mirroring the carefully arranged utensils. The family's antique silverware, neatly organized on a white linen tablecloth, seemed a relic of better times when that kitchen was the vibrant heart of the house. Beatrice sighed, recalling the days when laughter echoed through those walls, and meals were a moment of family unity. Now, she preferred to come down earlier, taking advantage of the few moments of peace before the rest of the house awoke. "Ambrose always says I need to eat better," she thought, looking at the bread with butter left on the porcelain plate. Her desire to eat was almost non-existent, but she knew that Nora, the loyal housekeeper, would be hurt if she left the breakfast untouched. The quiet tranquility of the morning was abruptly interrupted by the sound of high heels echoing against the marble, a symphony of control and imposition that Beatrice knew well. Sabrina, her daughter-in-law, entered the kitchen as if strutting down a catwalk, her presence filling the room with a mix of glamour and tension. Nearly 6 feet tall, the woman was the personification of modern Mexican beauty. Her perfectly straightened and shiny black hair framed her immaculately made-up face. She wore a tight red dress that seemed more appropriate for an evening event than a family breakfast. The jewelry she wore, discreet but clearly expensive, caught the light in a way that highlighted her elegance, as if she knew every move was being watched. "Darling, why are you eating alone?" Sabrina's melodious voice cut the air, laced with a rehearsed sweetness that made Beatrice cringe internally. That rhetorical question wasn't seeking an answer, only the reaffirmation of her superiority. Before Beatrice could respond, Sabrina raised her voice, now almost theatrical. "Ambrose, come see your mother having breakfast alone in the kitchen." Her intonation was carefully calculated to sound like genuine concern, but Beatrice knew it was just another scene for her son. It didn't take long for Ambrose Lockwood to enter the kitchen, his firm steps echoing down the hallway before he appeared in the doorway. At 45 years old, Ambrose was the living image of the success that Sabrina loved to display. Tall like his father, with slightly graying black hair at the temples and a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, he radiated confidence and efficiency. His brown eyes, identical to his mother's, shone with sincere concern as he looked at Beatrice. "Mum, why didn't you let us know? Sabrina always insists that we have breakfast together," he said, adjusting his tie as he approached. His voice had a caring tone, but Beatrice knew he was blind to the reality happening around him. "I didn't want to bother," she mumbled, avoiding meeting her son's eyes. Sabrina's watchful, predatory gaze made her stomach churn. Before she could say anything else, Sabrina stepped forward and enveloped her mother-in-law in an embrace. To Ambrose, the gesture seemed an act of affection, but to Beatrice it was like being surrounded by thorns. Sabrina whispered in the elderly woman's ear with a flawless smile that concealed her true intention. "Always so humble, isn't it? But remember, times have changed." Ambrose's cell phone began to ring, an insistent melody that interrupted the moment and brought temporary relief to Beatrice. "It's the office, I need to take this," he said, hurriedly leaving the kitchen while adjusting the expensive watch on his wrist. Beatrice felt a wave of relief and dread simultaneously. Ambrose's absence meant she would be alone with Sabrina, a prospect that made her skin crawl. As soon as Ambrose left the kitchen, Sabrina's mask fell off. Leaning over her mother-in-law, her red lips moved close to the elderly woman's ear, and her voice, now icy and cutting, spoke softly. "Meddling old woman," Sabrina whispered in Beatrice's ear, her warm breath making the elder shudder. "Next time I catch you in this kitchen, you won't just be eating in the servants' quarters. Who knows, maybe I'll send you straight to the most miserable public nursing home I can find. Those where the elderly are forgotten and mistreated. It would be perfect for you. Or better yet, how about going a few days without food? They say at your age, hunger can cause so much mental confusion. Ambrose would be so worried to see his mommy wasting away, losing her memory. Now get out of my sight before I lose my patience." Beatrice froze, her heart pounding erratically. She wanted to respond, but her throat seemed dry and powerless. She felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, unable to defend herself or escape. The tension was interrupted by the arrival of Evangeline, the 8-year-old granddaughter, who entered the kitchen skipping with an impeccable school uniform and white bows holding her black hair. The girl's innocent smile was a sight that should have brought comfort, but the words that came out of her mouth quickly dissipated any hope of peace. "Grandma, didn't Mom say old people can't eat in the main kitchen?" Her childlike voice carried the same venom that Beatrice so feared in Sabrina. The elderly woman felt a pang in her heart as she realized how the mother's cruelty was already beginning to poison the daughter's innocence. Beatrice brought her hand to her chest, trying to control her breathing that now seemed to escape her control. She felt suffocated, as if the air in the kitchen had become rarefied. The porcelain cup in her hands slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering on the floor with a sound that seemed to amplify the tension in the room. The noise made Nora, the 68-year-old housekeeper, rush into the kitchen. "Mrs. Beatrice." "What happened?" exclaimed Nora, her eyes filling with genuine concern as she saw the state of her employer. Before Sabrina could intervene, Nora ran towards Beatrice, placing her hand on her back to support her. "Mr. Ambrose! Mr. Ambrose!" "Calm quickly, Mrs. Beatrice is feeling unwell," shouted the housekeeper, her voice laden with desperation. Evangeline watched the scene with morbid curiosity, while Sabrina remained motionless, her arms crossed and a discreet smile on her red lips, as if enjoying a show. Ambrose rushed into the kitchen, his eyes wide as he saw his hunched-over mother trying to catch her breath. "Mom, what happened?" He knelt beside her, firmly holding her hands, while Nora was already looking for something to help the elderly woman. Beatrice, with blurred vision and fading strength, managed to glimpse the expression of satisfaction on Sabrina's lips before her consciousness began to fail. The last thing she saw was Nora's look of genuine concern, something she had long since stopped receiving from her own family. The luxurious room at San Angel Hospital was a refuge for few, a space that combined comfort and cutting-edge technology. The soft beige walls were decorated with discreet landscape paintings, chosen to convey serenity. The floor was covered in light wood, an elegant contrast with the modern medical equipment which flashed discreet lights and emitted rhythmic sounds. The hospital bed, more like a high-end adjustable armchair, had immaculate white sheets folded with precision. Beatrice Aldridge de Lockwood rested there, her frail body enveloped by that luxurious setting. However, the sophisticated environment was not enough to calm the tremor in her hands or the constant tightness in her chest. The doctor had left a short while ago after assuring that the malaise was not serious, just a spike in blood pressure caused by stress. The news, far from bringing relief, deepened Beatrice's anxiety. How could she explain that the real reason for her discomfort was the constant tension she lived in? What she was facing was not something that medicines or consultations could cure. The footsteps in the hallway, unmistakable to Beatrice, sounded like an announcement of more tension. Ambrose, her son, entered first, his firm stride betraying haste and concern. Tall and imposing in his navy blue suit, Ambrose was the personification of a successful businessman. "Mom, how are you feeling?" he asked immediately, crossing the room quickly. Before she could answer, Sabrina appeared right behind him. The daughter-in-law looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine, her sleek black hair styled to perfection, and her cream-colored body-hugging dress contrasted with the room's simplicity. Even after hours of waiting, Sabrina maintained her impeccable poise, as if she were never caught off guard. Nora, the faithful housekeeper, entered next. Although discreetly positioned at the door, the woman's kind eyes missed nothing. They soon settled on Beatrice, filled with genuine concern, a gesture that briefly comforted the matriarch. Finally, Evangeline emerged skipping, a stark contrast between childlike energy and the charged atmosphere of the room. The girl, impeccable with her black hair tied in bows, had the same astute look as her mother. "It was just a scare, thank God," said Ambrose, sitting down beside his mother. He gently took her hand, his eyes reflecting the love he felt for her. Beatrice wanted to smile to reassure him, but the weight of her reality prevented her. "Don't worry, Mum, we'll take care of everything so you can rest. You don't need to stress about anything." The words were an empty comfort. How could she rest, knowing that the greatest danger was right there by her side? Sabrina, keeping her sweet tone, leaned in slightly, as if studying Beatrice carefully. "Mother-in-law, you really need to take better care of your health. We're all worried about you, isn't that right, Ambrose?" Her voice was soft, but Beatrice felt the subtext like a cold blade. "So much stress isn't good at your age. Evangeline, come tell Grandma to take care of herself," she called, encouraging her daughter to approach. Evangeline smiled, a gesture that should have warmed Beatrice's heart, but carried a tone of learned defiance. "Old people are like that. They get sick over anything, don't they, Grandma? It must be so annoying to be old and weak." The childlike tone masked the cruelty that could only be taught, and Beatrice felt a stab in her heart. Nora, in the background, brought her hand to her mouth, unable to hide her indignation, while Sabrina smiled discreetly, as if her daughter's attitude were a personal triumph. Ambrose, seemingly oblivious to the weight of those words, looked at the watch on his wrist. "Mom, I'll go to the cafeteria to get you something to eat. Nora, can you come with us? Evangeline, come with Daddy." His practical and innocent suggestion made Beatrice freeze. Being alone with Sabrina was her worst nightmare. As always, Sabrina knew how to adapt to the moment. "Of course, darling. I'll stay and keep your mother company. I don't want her to feel alone." Her smile was impeccable, but Beatrice shivered as she noticed the predatory gleam in her eyes. Ambrose nodded, oblivious to what was happening around him, and left with Nora and Evangeline. The governess cast one last look at Beatrice before leaving, but her expression was one of helplessness. As soon as the door closed, Sabrina abandoned her mask. She walked slowly towards the bed, her heels echoing through the room. Each step seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Beatrice tried not to shrink back, but the strength in her body seemed to drain away. When Sabrina stopped beside the bed, leaning in slightly, her black eyes shone with malice. "Listen carefully, you meddling old woman," Sabrina said, speaking in close proximity, her voice turning to pure venom as she leaned over the hospital bed. "If you open that withered mouth of yours to tell anyone about our little incident in the kitchen, I promise high blood pressure will be the least of your problems. You know those pills you take every night? It would be a shame if they were switched for something stronger. Or maybe I'll need to remind Ambrose how your memory has been failing lately. Who do you think he'll believe? His devoted wife or the senile old woman who can barely remember where she left her glasses?" Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened on Beatrice's arm. "And don't think Nora can help you. One phone call from me and that miserable family of hers will be out on the street. You have no idea what I'm capable of, mother-in-law. And believe me, I'd love to have a reason to show you." The threatening tone was so real that Beatrice had to hold onto the bed to keep from trembling even more. She wanted to respond, but the words fled her mouth. Her heart was pounding erratically, and she feared Sabrina could hear the sound. However, a slight sound from the door caught the attention of both women. Nora, who had silently returned to retrieve her forgotten purse, stood in the partially open doorway, her eyes wide as she witnessed the scene. The shock on her face was evident, but not as much as the fear that crossed it when Sabrina turned around. Sabrina remained calm, but her gaze, now directed at Nora, had the intensity of a predator. "Nora, dear," she said, reverting to her sweet tone, "why don't you go help Ambrose with the coffee? You know how he likes it when you pick something special for his mother." The governess hesitated, her purse clutched in her trembling hands. She looked at Beatrice, who avoided her gaze and knew she had no choice. As Nora walked away, Sabrina didn't miss the opportunity to deliver one last veiled threat. "Oh, and Nora," her sweet voice now tinged with venom, You know that little house where your family lives? It would be a shame if something happened to the contract, don't you think? The sound of the closing door was like a final sentence. Hours later, the return to the Lockwood mansion was shrouded in a silence so dense it seemed to suffocate the car's occupants. The golden light of the Mexican late afternoon, which normally tinted the marble walls with welcoming hues, now cast disquieting shadows as if reflecting the growing tension. Beatrice, still weakened from the hospital episode, walked slowly into the house leaning on Nora. Their footsteps echoed through the luxurious corridors, each sound reverberating like a countdown to something terrible. Ambrose, distracted by messages on his phone, went straight to his office, delegating his mother's care to his wife and the governess, a decision that filled the two women remaining at Beatrice's side with apprehension. The Lockwood mansion, a true architectural masterpiece, seemed like a palace. The Italian marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the high walls displayed paintings by renowned Mexican artists. However, what was once a symbol of grandeur and family unity now seemed like a prison, each luxurious detail transformed into a cruel reminder of the inequality and power dynamics that dominated that house. Sabrina walked behind them, her heels marking a deliberate rhythm against the marble, as if each beat was a reminder of her authority. The woman carried herself like a queen in her domain, every move rehearsed to intimidate and control. She wore a tight red dress that, in the late afternoon light, seemed to acquire the hue of fresh blood. Her black hair, perfectly aligned, fell like a frame around her flawlessly made-up face. But it was her eyes that carried the true weight of the scene, two dark pools that watched Beatrice and Nora with predatory intensity. As they reached the long corridor leading to Beatrice's quarters, the tension became palpable. Nora, who walked beside the matriarch, noticed that her own hands were trembling as she held her employer's arm. She tried to remain strong, but the fear was evident on her face. In decades of service to the family, Nora had never felt such dread for herself or Beatrice. She knew that any misstep could mean not only her own ruin, but that of her entire family, who depended on the job and housing provided by the Lockwoods. Sabrina stopped beside them, watching like a cat playing with its prey. The already heavy atmosphere grew even more oppressive when she finally spoke, her voice as sweet as honey, but laced with venom. "Nora, dear," she began, approaching with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know, dear Nora." Sabrina drew closer like a feline circling its prey, her voice dripping with sweet venom. "I've been thinking about that humble little house where your family is living, the one my husband, out of pity, granted you. How many grandchildren do you have again? 5, 6? All so little. It would be a true tragedy if they ended up on the street, wouldn't it? Or worse. Imagine an anonymous report about elder abuse reaching social services right when your daughter is asking for custody of the children. And you know how cruel the system is to poor families." She adjusted a lock of hair with false casualness. "But I'm sure you're intelligent enough to keep your mouth shut. After all, we wouldn't want anything bad to happen to those innocent little children, would we?" She emphasized the "my" with an almost possessive tone, each syllable piercing the governess's heart like a knife. Nora stopped in her place, feeling her legs weaken under the weight of terror. Her hands, calloused by decades of faithful service to the Lockwood family, tightened their grip on Beatrice's arm, like castaways seeking salvation. The grey uniform, which she had always kept immaculate with such pride, now seemed to suffocate her. "Please, Mrs. Sabrina," she whispered, her voice shattering like broken crystal. "My grandchildren. They're just little kids. The youngest is only 3 years old. He needs his asthma medicine." Tears began to stream down her aged face as she continued. "My daughter is pregnant, alone. That house is all we have. Have mercy." Nora fell to her knees, decades of dignity forgotten in the face of the terror of seeing her family on the streets. "We have served your family for 3 generations. My mother raised Don Ambrose. I practically raised Evangeline." Her voice faltered when she saw the cruel pleasure in Sabrina's eyes. "Please, I'll do anything." Sabrina savored every second of that humiliation as if it were a fine wine. Her smile widened with each plea, each tear shed. She slowly approached Nora, her heels marking a cruel rhythm against the floor. "Anything?" she asked with false sweetness, leaning down to lift the governess's chin with a perfectly manicured finger. Then I suggest you keep that mouth of yours shut, or your precious family will find out what it's like to live under a bridge." Turning to Beatrice, Sabrina stepped forward, further reducing the space between them. "And you, mother-in-law," she said, leaning slightly. Sabrina whispered with a macabre smile, leaning over Beatrice. "After so much stress, I think you really need a special little sleeping remedy. You know, I've been researching medications for the elderly. It's amazing how some are so strong they can leave a person sleeping for days. And the most interesting part is that some can even cause permanent mental confusion." She ran her fingers over the pill bottle in the pocket of her dress. "Imagine you sleeping so deeply that you couldn't even tell Ambrose about our little chats. Or better yet, waking up so confused that no one would believe a single word you say. Wouldn't it be good to rest a bit, mother-in-law? A very deep sleep?" The veiled threat made Beatrice clutch the stair railing beside her, desperately seeking some stability. Evangeline's arrival, as if choreographed, further amplified the discomfort of the moment. The girl seemed a reflection of her mother, both in appearance and behavior. Approaching with light steps, she smiled at her grandmother, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. "Mom, can I give Grandma her medicine today?" she asked with a frightening sweetness, her childish voice perfectly masking the cruelty contained in her words. Beatrice felt her blood run cold. What else had that child learned from her mother? Sabrina let out a low laugh, brimming with pride. She placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and replied, "Of course, my love. Who knows, one day you might help Mommy with everything in this house too." The words were spoken as a joke, but Beatrice knew each one carried a purpose. The sound of approaching male footsteps broke the moment. Ambrose, followed by Graham, the guest Beatrice recognized from previous dinners, entered the hallway. "Darling, where are you? Graham just arrived." Ambrose's voice echoed through the space, full of animation. Upon hearing the man's name, Sabrina lifted her head with a glint in her eyes that Beatrice immediately recognized. It was a different kind of interest, one she wished she hadn't noticed. Quickly, Sabrina adjusted her posture, like an actress entering the scene. The transformation was instant. The cruel look disappeared, replaced by a warm smile and the demeanor of a devoted wife. "We're here, dear," she responded with a melodious voice, walking gracefully towards the men. The contrast between her attitude seconds before and her new persona was so great that Beatrice felt a knot forming in her throat. Nora, seizing the distraction, tried to guide Beatrice to her room. But before they could move away, Sabrina intercepted them with an almost imperceptible gesture. No, all together. After all, we're a family, aren't we?" Her words carried the force of an order. Beatrice tried to protest but couldn't find her voice. Evangeline clapped her hands, excited by the idea. To any outside observer, it seemed a harmonious scene of a happy family. As Ambrose and Graham's footsteps drew nearer, Nora tried once more to protect her mistress. "Mrs. Beatrice is still very tired. Perhaps she should rest a bit before lunch," she said, her voice cautious. Sabrina shot a look at the governess that seemed capable of freezing the air around her. "Nonsense," she replied with artificial sweetness. "She'll love the company, and Graham has always been so close to the family." The emphasis on clothes was laden with other intentions, something Nora immediately noticed and made her skin crawl. Beatrice remained motionless as Sabrina approached Graham. He was a tall man with grey hair, dressed in calculated casualness that denoted his wealth. "Dear Graham," Sabrina exclaimed, her voice overflowing with charm. "How good that you came. We were just taking Beatrice to freshen up a bit before lunch." Her smile was warm, but there was a glint in her eyes that only Nora seemed to notice, a look that lingered on Graham for a second longer than appropriate. As Sabrina led everyone to the dining room, Evangeline took the opportunity to approach her grandmother once more. "Grandma," the girl whispered, her voice laden with disguised malice, "if you don't behave during lunch, Mom said she'll give you a medicine that will make you sleep all day." The childish tone masked the threat, but the impact on Beatrice was devastating. The matriarch tried to gather strength as she felt the weight of her world crumbling around her. Graham, oblivious to the family's toxic dynamic, walked calmly beside Ambrose, both commenting on business. Sabrina, leading the group with Evangeline in tow, seemed more powerful than ever. And Nora, ever watchful, stayed one step behind, her vigilant eyes on Beatrice, fearing what else might happen at that fateful lunch. The Lockwood Mansion's office was an environment that exuded power and sophistication. The dark mahogany-paneled walls reflected the warm light of an antique lamp, casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the high ceiling. The heavy, almost oppressive green velvet curtains were slightly ajar, allowing the last glimmer of the Mexican afternoon to enter through the French windows. The wide, waxed floorboards creaked softly under the footsteps of anyone daring to cross that space. The central desk, a massive mahogany piece with bronze details, was impeccably organized except for a brown envelope that seemed to carry the weight of a forbidden secret. Graham Caldwell, always impeccable in his dark grey Italian suit, was leaning over the desk. His greying hair, meticulously combed, glistened under the dim light, while his calculated smile gave him an almost unshakable appearance of confidence. But there was something in his gaze, a glimmer of ambition that betrayed the superficial calm. Seated there, he seemed more like an actor rehearsing his performance than a man at ease. Lunch had ended minutes before, and Ambrose, distracted with his business, hurried away for a video conference. This interval was the moment Sabrina and Graham had been waiting for. As soon as Ambrose disappeared upstairs, Sabrina closed the office door behind her with a soft click that sounded loud in the silence. The sound of the lock resonated through the room like the first sign of a plot that was about to unfold. She walked towards Graham, her stiletto heels marking a steady rhythm on the wooden floor. Each step was calculated, every movement seemed rehearsed to project power and control. The tight red dress Sabrina wore captured the last rays of the day, making her appear like a living flame in that dim environment. Her shiny black hair fell in perfect waves, and her eyes, two pools of unfathomable darkness, were fixed on Graham. She moved like a predator about to attack, her long, well-groomed fingers sliding across the desk's surface. "Did you bring everything?" she asked, her voice low but laced with authority. Graham smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and took an envelope from his Italian leather briefcase. "The life insurance papers are here," he replied, placing the envelope on the table with exaggerated care. His voice was controlled, but there was an undertone of barely disguised satisfaction. "Now we just need to make sure he signs the last document, and of course, that your dear mother-in-law doesn't interfere." Sabrina's expression instantly hardened. She leaned over the desk, moving closer to Graham with eyes that seemed to want to pierce him. "That old woman is suspecting something," she hissed, with a contained fury that seemed about to explode at any moment. "And Nora, that meddlesome maid, is watching me too closely. Today at the hospital she almost—" Sabrina broke off, her gaze abruptly shifting to the half-open door. For a moment the silence in the office was absolute. Even Graham's breathing seemed to cease. Then a soft sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, breaking the tension. Sabrina quickly straightened up, recomposing herself like an actress returning to the stage. The door opened further, revealing Evangeline's small, impeccable figure. Her eyes, as black as her mother's, shone with curiosity, but there was something more there, something Beatrice feared to recognize. "Uncle Graham," Evangeline began, her childlike voice laden with sweetness, "are you really going to give Dad a special gift?" Her question sounded innocent, but the smile that accompanied the words betrayed a sinister understanding. The girl knew more than she should, and Graham and Sabrina instantly understood this. Graham, regaining his composure, smiled back at the girl. "Yes, dear," he replied in an affectionate tone. "A gift Dad will never forget." Sabrina watched the interaction with a mixture of pride and caution, her arms crossed over her chest, like a lioness protecting her territory. Sabrina then approached her daughter, bending down slightly until she was at the girl's level. "Evangeline, my love," she began with a sweet voice that masked the ice in her tone, "why don't you go see if Grandma has taken her medicine? You know how forgetful she's been lately." Her suggestion was imbued with an underlying cruelty, and Evangeline smiled in response, as if she perfectly understood the insinuation. Before the girl could answer, a sound in the hallway captured the attention of the three. Nora passed silently, the fabric of her grey uniform almost merging with the late afternoon shadows. For a brief moment, Nora's and Sabrina's gazes met. In the governess's eyes there was horror and fear. In Sabrina's, only coldness and contempt. Graham, perceiving the gravity of the situation, began to hastily put away the papers, his previously calculated movements now becoming tenser. "We need to be more careful," he muttered, adjusting his silk tie while glancing towards the door. "Ambrose cannot suspect anything until we are ready." Sabrina, however, seemed unshaken. She smiled slightly, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "Don't worry about Nora," she said, her voice low but laden with determination. "I already have plans for her and that wretched family of hers. Soon she will no longer be a problem." Her tone was so cold that even Graham, accustomed to her lack of scruples, seemed to shudder. Evangeline was still standing at the door, watching the scene with morbid curiosity. "Mommy," the girl called, her sweet voice contrasting with the content of her words. "Can I help make Nora go away? Just like we're going to help Daddy rest forever?" Pride shone in Sabrina's eyes as she looked at her daughter. "Of course, my angel," she replied, caressing the girl's face with delicate fingers. "You're learning so fast." At that moment, the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, plunging the office into deep shadows. Graham, trying to recompose himself, turned on the desk lamp. The yellowish light illuminated only a small circle around them, while the rest of the office remained dark, as if the scene were being staged under spotlights. The shadows projected on the walls took on grotesque shapes, reinforcing the atmosphere of conspiracy. "The life insurance is at the maximum value," Graham whispered, as if fearing someone might overhear through the walls. "And with the modifications we made to the will." He did not finish the sentence, for Sabrina raised her hand, asking for silence. Her senses seemed sharpened, catching something beyond Graham's reach. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Ambrose was returning from the video conference, rapidly approaching. Sabrina, with the deftness of one who lives by appearances, rearranged the scene in seconds. She turned to Evangeline with a sweet smile. "Dear, go play in the garden. Uncle Graham and I need to finish the preparations for Daddy's surprise party, remember?" Evangeline nodded, but cast a last curious glance at the documents on the table before leaving. As Ambrose approached, Nora remained hidden in the shadows of the hallway. Her heart was racing, her hands trembling, as she held the cell phone with which she had recorded the conversation. She knew that recording was the only proof of what she had just witnessed. However, what Nora did not know was that Sabrina had already noticed the reflection of the phone's screen glare on the glass door of the office. "You know, my dear," the daughter-in-law began, her melodious voice dripping with venom. "You know, my sweet." Sabrina approached the armchair slowly, her fingers sliding over the medicine bottles. "I've been researching some wonderful nursing homes, especially those far away from here, in the poorer neighborhoods of the city, places where no one asks questions when the elderly. Troublemakers show up with a few bruises, where the screams at night are so common that no one cares anymore, where visits are discouraged. And most interestingly, many of these places have special wings for patients who develop sudden mental issues. Can you just imagine one day to the next, a perfectly lucid lady starts having terrible hallucinations, mental confusion? It's amazing how some medications can cause that kind of effect, isn't it? And poor Ambrose will be so busy taking care of the business that he'll hardly have time for visits. After all, who would want to see a mother who doesn't even recognize her own son anymore?" Her words were accompanied by a drumming of long, well-groomed fingers over the medicine bottles. The sound, repetitive and cold, filled the silence of the room like a threatening drip. Beatrice felt panic growing inside her. She tried to respond, but her voice came out weaker than she would have liked. "My son would never allow," she said, more like a prayer than a statement. Her eyes searched for something, anything, that could bring her comfort at that moment. But the smile Sabrina displayed in response dispelled any hope. "Your son?" Sabrina laughed, a low and cruel sound that made Beatrice shudder. She approached her mother-in-law like a snake about to strike, her heels marking each step with threatening precision. "Your precious Ambrose does absolutely everything I want, dear mother-in-law. Every decision, every thought. Everything goes through my scrutiny." She began circling the armchair where Beatrice was seated, her fingers gliding over the velvet backrest. "Or haven't you realized how he didn't even question your little incident in the kitchen? How he so easily accepted that you slipped, that you're confused?" Each word was uttered with sadistic pleasure. Leaning in until her face was inches from Beatrice's, her expensive perfume suffocating the air between them, Sabrina continued, "Do you know why? Because I built the perfect wife, the devoted mother he always dreamed of. The concerned daughter-in-law everyone admires, every smile, every public gesture of affection, meticulously planned. She gripped Beatrice's chin forcefully, forcing her mother-in-law to look at her. Who do you think he'll believe? The beloved wife who never left his side, who gave him the perfect family? Or the senile old woman who can barely remember where she left her glasses? Her smile widened as she saw the fear in her mother-in-law's eyes. Speaking of memory, those sleeping pills of yours, sometimes I wonder if they're not too strong. It would be a shame if you started having more serious episodes of confusion. The sound of childish footsteps in the hallway interrupted the cruel monologue. Beatrice froze upon hearing the soft shuffle of slippers on the floor. Evangeline appeared at the door, wearing a delicate embroidered silk pajama, the picture of childish innocence. But the glint in the girl's eyes revealed something darker. "Look, Evangeline, how helpful," Sabrina said, turning to her daughter with a smile that mixed pride and something more perverse. "Come here, dear. Help Mommy take care of Grandma." Evangeline entered the room carrying a glass of water, holding it with her small hands. Her eyes shone with malice, a disturbing reflection of her mother's influence. "Grandma, drink it all up," she sang with unsettling sweetness. "Mommy said old people need lots of water, especially before bedtime. Isn't that right, Mommy?" Beatrice's hands were shaking so much that she could barely hold the glass when the girl offered it to her. Sabrina, with her arms crossed and a satisfied look, seemed to be watching the performance of her masterpiece. The combination of terror in Beatrice's eyes and Evangeline's somber obedience was what she appeared to aim for. "Do you know what else I learned about nursing homes, dear?" Sabrina continued, pacing around the room and casually adjusting the pillows on the bed. "Some have special wings for patients with mental issues. Those who start having hallucinations, imagining things, accusing innocent people of mistreatment." She shot a sharp look at Beatrice, who felt her stomach churn. Evangeline watched the scene with morbid curiosity. "Mommy?" the girl asked, looking at her mother as if seeking approval. "Is it true that when old people get really confused, they need stronger medication?" "Yes, darling," Sabrina replied, caressing her daughter's hair with delicate fingers. "And sometimes when the old folks don't want to cooperate, we need to. Help them understand that it's for their own good. Isn't that right, mother-in-law?" She looked directly at Beatrice, her cold eyes meeting her mother-in-law's in the reflection of the vanity mirror. The trembling in Beatrice's hands became uncontrollable. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering into hundreds of pieces against the marble floor. The water spilled around the armchair, reflecting the light from the lamp like tiny tears. Sabrina remained motionless, merely observing as a slow, cruel smile curved her lips. "So clumsy, Grandma," Evangeline commented, her childish voice carrying a venomous tone. "I think Mommy is right. You really do need special care." The statement was uttered with a disturbing naturalness, as if it were an absolute truth. Sabrina took a step forward, her heels crushing the shards of glass in her path. The sound echoed through the room, a frightening reminder of the control she exerted. Bending down, she picked up a fresh glass from the silver tray and filled it with water. "Don't worry, my sweet old lady," she said, her voice now low but still laden with threat. "We have all night ahead of us to make sure you take your remedies." The light from the lamps cast distorted shadows on the walls, amplifying the sensation of suffocation. Beatrice knew that at that moment, she was completely at the mercy of her daughter-in-law's refined cruelty and her granddaughter's ruthless gaze, who should have once brought joy to her life. The morning in the city awoke with a gentle breeze that swayed the bougainvillea leaves in the garden of the Lockwood mansion. The sky displayed shades of pink and golden, a spectacle of beauty that seemed to mock the darkness of the previous night's events. The mansion, with its light stone facade and wrought iron details, remained imposing, but within its walls, the atmosphere was tense. In the vast garden, Nora walked carefully, balancing a silver tray with breakfast. Her steps were hesitant on the pebbled path that wound between the flower beds, as if each step carried the weight of what she knew. In the distance, a sound made her stop. It was a muffled sob, almost imperceptible, but Nora knew that sound. It wasn't the first time she had heard Beatrice's crying. During the nights, the sobs escaped from the matriarch's room, echoing like the laments of a lost soul. Now the sound came from the gazebo at the back of the garden, where the flowering vines created a shady refuge. Nora's heart tightened as she recognized the pain in those sobs. She knew that Beatrice was no longer the strong, self-assured woman she had known, but a frightened shadow of who she once was. She approached the gazebo with soft steps, her hands gripping the tray as if it were a shield against the forces she feared. There, on one of the white-painted wooden benches, Beatrice was curled up, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. The blue silk robe she wore, once a symbol of elegance, now seemed too large for her thin, hunched body. Her hands trembled as she held an embroidered handkerchief, vainly trying to dry the tears that streamed down her wrinkled face. The morning's brilliance reflected in the droplets, transforming them into tiny prisms that contrasted with the expression of pure despair. "Mrs. Beatrice," Nora called, her voice low, almost fearing to break the silence of the moment. "You haven't eaten anything today?" She approached slowly, her movements measured like someone approaching an injured bird. The tray carried fresh coffee, soft bread, and perfectly arranged fruit, a meal that should bring comfort, but now seemed only a reminder of emptiness. Beatrice raised her gaze, and what Nora saw in her eyes made her stomach churn. There was terror, deep and paralyzing. The matriarch gripped the governess's arm with a surprising strength for someone so frail. She began, but her voice failed before she could complete. She took a deep breath, trying to gather strength. "She said she's going to send me to a nursing home." Her words came out in an urgent whisper, almost begging for help. "She said she'll convince Ambrose that I'm crazy." "Nora," she described horrible places where no one would hear me scream. Nora felt her heart tighten even more. She set the tray down on the small gazebo table and sat down beside Beatrice, momentarily breaking the barriers that had always separated mistress and servant. "Mrs. Beatrice, this cannot continue like this," she said, her voice charged with emotion. "We need to tell Mr. Ambrose. He has to know what's happening before it's too late." Before she could continue, a childish voice cut through the air like a blade. "Grandma's talking to herself again, Mommy," said Evangeline, her voice laden with false innocence. The girl stood at the entrance to the gazebo, her school uniform neat and a malicious smile mirroring her mother's. Nora stood up immediately, regaining her servile posture, but the damage was already done. Sabrina emerged right behind her daughter, her imposing figure standing out against the soft morning light. She wore an emerald green silk ensemble that seemed to glimmer with each movement, as if it were the skin of a snake about to attack. Her face was impeccably made up, but it was in her eyes that the true venom concentrated. "Darling, what a fright," she said, approaching with firm steps, while her voice took on a tone of false concern. "Walking around the garden like that, all alone, after all your recent episodes." Beatrice tried to stand up, but her legs faltered. Instinctively, Nora extended her hand to help, but Sabrina's sharp gaze made her stop. "You should rest, sweetie," Sabrina continued, leaning slightly over her mother-in-law. "Ambrose and I were just talking about getting you some professional help, places where they could take good care of you." The sound of male footsteps on the stone path drew everyone's attention. Ambrose approached, his erect posture and impeccable navy blue suit standing out against the garden's backdrop. His expression was a mix of confusion and concern. The sun reflected off his glasses, making it difficult to read his eyes, but there was something in the tension of his shoulders that suggested doubt. "Daddy!" Evangeline shouted, running towards him. Her voice seemed laden with childlike sweetness, but Nora knew it was a rehearsed performance. Grandma was talking to herself again, and Nora was here with her. Just like that time Mommy said they were plotting something. Sabrina walked over to Ambrose with her usual elegance, immediately assuming the role of devoted wife. "Darling," she began, her voice mellifluous, "I think we need to talk about your mother." She cast a quick glance at Beatrice, as if reinforcing her concern. "It's been a while since I've noticed worrying behaviors." Nora remained motionless, feeling powerless as the web of lies was woven before her. In her hand, the handkerchief Beatrice had dropped felt like an unbearable weight. In the pocket of her apron, the cell phone with the recording of the conversation between Sabrina and Graham burned like a secret that could save or destroy lives. Ambrose slowly approached the gazebo, his eyes fixed on his mother. There was something different in her expression now, a spark of doubt that hadn't been there before. Sabrina noticed too. For a brief moment her smile wavered, but she quickly regained it. "Ambrose," she said, trying to catch his attention, but her voice didn't sound as confident as before. The shrill ringing of Ambrose's phone interrupted the moment. He looked at the screen and sighed. "It's Graham," he said, already answering the call. "It must be about the business we discussed yesterday." He walked away, his voice fading into a murmur in the background. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Sabrina remained still, watching Ambrose walk away. When he finally disappeared from sight, her smile changed. It was no longer the mask of concern she wore in front of her husband, but a cold and calculated expression. She turned to Beatrice and Nora, her gaze laden with malice. The game wasn't over yet, but at that moment Nora knew the pieces were about to shift. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the Lockwood Mansion's living room, creating soft, colorful patterns that danced across the antique furniture. The intricately carved wooden chairs, with upholstery in shades of gold, reflected the light as a reminder of the opulence this house exuded. Yet the beauty of the surroundings was merely a facade for the tension that filled the air. On the deep red velvet sofa, Sabrina and Graham sat too close like conspiratorial accomplices. Their relaxed postures and occasional laughter hid the rot of their plans. Graham's dark grey suit was impeccable, contrasting with Sabrina's emerald green dress, which shimmered slightly under the filtered light from the stained glass. The sweet scent of Sabrina's expensive perfume mingled with the woody smell of the cognac Graham held in a crystal glass. The white marble coffee table with gold accents supported carefully arranged documents beside an unlit cigar. The room, usually a space for family gatherings, was now the stage for sordid secrets. The classic wall clock marked 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a time Sabrina knew to be safe. Ambrose was still at his office, immersed in the business he entrusted blindly to his best friend. The perfection of the plan, Sabrina thought, as her fingers smoothed an imaginary crease in the fabric of her dress. "The plan is perfect," Graham murmured, leaning back on the sofa. His eyes glinted with an almost feral ambition. "The life insurance has been increased to $5 million. No one will suspect a heart attack in a stressed man." He swirled the cognac in his glass, watching the amber liquid as if foreseeing his victory. His fingers brushed against Sabrina's as he set the glass on the table, and he smiled, testing the limits of their complicity. Sabrina leaned in closer, her elegant posture contrasting with the intensity of her words. The fabric of her dress slid against the velvet of the sofa, creating a soft sound that almost disappeared beneath the weight of their dialogue. "Before that, we need to eliminate the obstacles," she said, her voice low but laden with determination. Her dark eyes were locked with Graham's. "Nora, that nosy old woman is starting to sniff around too much." Sabrina leaned even closer to Graham, her voice a venomous whisper. "That meddlesome maid has heard things she shouldn't have. You know what's most interesting? Her eldest son works security in that dangerous neighborhood. It would be a tragedy if he had an accident at work, wouldn't it? And the younger one, the pregnant one, imagine the despair of a young single mother with nowhere to live with her baby. As for our dear mother-in-law, I was researching some public nursing homes in the more problematic areas of the city, the ones where patients tend to disappear mysteriously and no one asks questions. We need to eliminate these inconveniences before they open their mouths. And you know I always get what I want, don't you, dear?" The silence that followed was heavy with malice. Graham kept his smile, but there was a shadow of hesitation in his eyes. He poured himself more cognac before responding. "And what about the admission?" he asked, his casual tone contrasting with the content of his words. "Is the doctor already prepared to certify the old woman's dementia?" He leaned in slightly, as if his interest were purely practical, but the smile on his lips betrayed the pleasure he took in this scheme. Sabrina raised her eyebrows, clearly pleased with her own foresight. "All arranged," she replied, a satisfied smile curving her red lips. "Dr. Garcia is very receptive when the value is adequate. After Ambrose dies, it will be easy to convince everyone that his poor mother went mad with grief. A classic case of emotional collapse." She laughed softly, the crystalline sound like a cracked glass about to shatter. The sound of tiny footsteps momentarily interrupted the conversation. Evangeline played nearby the piano, her small hands clumsily sliding across the keys. The fragmented melody that came from the instrument seemed an unsettling echo of the disorder that inhabited this house. Wearing a frilly lilac dress, the little girl looked like a porcelain doll, perfect on the outside but hollow within. "And what about the girl?" Graham asked, turning his head to watch Evangeline. His voice carried an almost paternal tone, but there was something else there, a concern he tried to mask with a casual expression. "Isn't she too young to understand all this?" His eyes met Sabrina's, hoping for an answer that might ease his conscience. Sabrina cast a glance at her daughter, her smile widening into a perverse pride. "My little one is learning well," she replied, beckoning Evangeline with an elegant gesture. "Isn't that right, darling? Tell Uncle Graham what Mommy taught you about useless old people." The sweetness in her voice contrasted with the venom it carried. Evangeline approached with graceful steps, her dark curls swaying gently, her large dark eyes fixed on Graham before answering, her childlike voice clear and calm. "Mom said old people are a nuisance, Uncle. They just get in the way and need to be removed." A smile appeared on her lips, small but laden with malice. It was a perfect replica of Sabrina's smile, precisely molded by years of influence. At that moment, a subtle movement caught Evangeline's attention. Through the reflection in the Venetian mirror in the room, she saw something. Ambrose was standing in the entrance, partially hidden by the French silk curtain. His figure was motionless, but his presence was unmistakable. The face that usually displayed serenity was now marked by shock, his wide eyes fixed on the trio before him. "And you know what else, Uncle?" Evangeline continued, unaware that her father was listening to every word. "Mom said that after Daddy goes to heaven, we'll be very rich, and Grandma will go to a special place where no one will believe her stories." The girl's voice sounded melodious, almost too sweet for the gravity of what she was saying. The sound of breaking glass cut through the air. Ambrose, without realizing it, had dropped his phone to the floor. Sabrina and Graham startled, turning to look for the source of the noise. But Ambrose, moved by quick reflexes, silently retreated down the hallway before they could see him. His heart pounded erratically, and his mind struggled to process what he had just heard. The reality he knew was crumbling. Sabrina rose from the couch with fluid movements, smoothing her dress as if nothing had happened. "Speaking of your father," she said in a casual tone, "we need to finalize the preparations for tomorrow's special dinner. It will be an unforgettable night." Her voice carried a veiled promise that she knew only Graham would understand. In the hallway, Ambrose leaned against the wall, his breath heavy and uneven. The last few minutes had revealed a truth he had never imagined possible. 20 years of marriage, a decades-long friendship with Graham, it was all a lie. His daughter's words echoed in his mind like a death knell. Mum said that after Daddy goes to heaven. The sound of Sabrina's laughter pierced the walls, mingling with the clinking of Graham's crystal glass and Evangeline's childlike voice. It was a macabre symphony that finally opened Ambrose's eyes to the truth that had been in front of him all along. Night had settled over the Lockwood mansion like a heavy cloak of secrets. Outside, the treetops swayed gently in the breeze, casting undulating shadows across the tall windows. Inside the study, Ambrose worked under the warm glow of an antique lamp, creating a pool of dim illumination amidst the shadowy surroundings. The dark wooden bookshelves crammed with volumes and the sturdy mahogany furnishings lent the space an air of solidity and tradition, but tonight everything felt more oppressive. The silence was broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock, each beat seeming to synchronize with Ambrose's racing thoughts. Seated at his desk, Ambrose's face, usually serene, was etched with tension. His green eyes seemed lost, fixed on some indeterminate point on the desktop as he tried to piece together the puzzle forming in his mind. The words he had overheard earlier, coming from his own daughter, echoed incessantly. "After Daddy goes to heaven." It was a childlike and cruel phrase, delivered with unsettling sweetness, but containing the bitter truth of a conspiracy he was just beginning to comprehend. His hands trembled slightly as he rifled through drawers and files. He needed proof, something to confirm what his heart already knew to be true. Each document he examined seemed to pulse with added weight, as if the paper carried not just information, but the fate of his family. The clock struck 11 when Ambrose found the first evidence, a life insurance policy in his name. The numbers leapt out at him immediately, the value astronomically higher than what he remembered purchasing. What truly made his stomach churn was the date of the alteration, coinciding with the start of Sabrina's and Graham's frequent business meetings. Ambrose rubbed his face with both hands, trying to shake off the crushing weight of the discovery. The final detail was like a punch to the gut. One of the signatures on the document was an almost perfect imitation of his own. He recognized the handwriting only because he knew the intricacies of his own signature strokes. With trembling fingers, he continued his search, a sense of urgency growing with each passing second. He opened a hidden compartment at the back of the desk, revealing something even more disturbing. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers to accounts he didn't recognize, all made by Graham in recent months. Beside them, a folder containing supposed medical evaluations of his health, documents detailing a progressive deterioration he had never experienced. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his investigation, making his heart race. Ambrose froze, his breath caught. For one terrifying moment he thought it might be Sabrina, but soon realized the cadence was different, hesitant, cautious. The door slowly opened, revealing Nora, still dressed in her grey housekeeper's uniform. Her face was etched with worry, the lines of expression deeper than usual. "Don Ambrose," she called, her voice almost a whisper, "there is something you need to know." Ambrose gestured for her to enter and quickly closed the door behind her, locking it with a click that sounded loud in the silence of the office. He could see the fear in Nora's eyes, the same fear he felt. Her wrinkled hands were twisted on her apron, as if seeking something to anchor her. "Nora, please," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Tell me everything, no matter how terrible it is." The loyalty built over decades between employer and employee created a moment of absolute honesty. Nora took a deep breath, taking a cell phone out of her pocket with trembling hands. "I have a recording, Don Ambrose," she began, her voice faltering slightly. "Doña Sabrina and Don Graham, they were in the office earlier today." Her eyes shifted to the door, as if fearing someone might overhear her. Before she could continue, an almost imperceptible sound in the hallway made them both freeze. Ambrose gave a slight nod, encouraging her to go on. Nora tapped the screen of the cell phone, and the audio began to play. Sabrina's voice echoed in the small space, so familiar and yet strangely cold. "The poison can't be detected. It will seem like a heart attack." Ambrose felt his whole body stiffen as he heard Graham calmly respond, discussing the details of the plan as if talking about a dinner menu. The conversation continued, filled with occasional laughter and a tone of confidence that only intensified the horror of the situation. As they listened, neither of them noticed the small shadow moving outside. Evangeline, still in her silk pajamas, peered through the crack in the door, her dark eyes shining with the malice that seemed to have been born in her. Silently, the girl quickly retreated, running through the corridors with a smile that didn't match her age. "They plan to do it tomorrow night," Nora continued, turning off the audio and stuffing the cell phone back into her pocket. Her voice now visibly trembled. "During the special dinner that Doña Sabrina is organizing. Don Ambrose, they also have plans for your mother. They want to commit her to a horrible place where no one will hear her." Tears began to stream down the wrinkled face of the housekeeper, her hands shaking so much that Ambrose had to hold them to calm her down. Ambrose felt as if the ground was disappearing from under his feet. He sank into the leather chair, his hands buried in his hair. 20 years of marriage, decades of friendship with Graham, it was all an illusion, a macabre play that would culminate in his own death. "My mother's medicine," he muttered, a new thought hitting him with force. "Sabrina has insisted on giving it to her personally. She always says Nora is too busy to take care of it." He looked up, filled with terror. What has she been giving my mother? Before Nora could answer, another noise came from the hallway, louder this time. They both startled, and Ambrose quickly put the incriminating documents away in the drawer. His brain was working overtime, formulating a plan as time seemed to run out rapidly. "Nora," he whispered, his voice firm despite the panic, "don't leave my mother alone with Sabrina. Not for a minute. Tomorrow we need to act before the dinner." Before he could complete his instructions, the distinct sound of high heels echoed down the hallway, each step like a drum announcing Sabrina's arrival. Nora's look filled with panic, but Ambrose made a discreet gesture for her to leave through a side door. "Go now," he whispered, "and be careful." As Nora disappeared into the darkness of the side corridor, Evangeline had already reached her parents' room. "Mommy," she called, her voice laced with feigned urgency. "Daddy is in the office with Nora." They were listening to something on her cell phone. Sabrina, who was sitting at the vanity, adjusting her diamond earrings, slowly raised her head. Her reflection in the mirror showed a smile slowly growing, a predatory smile. "Very good, dear," she murmured, rising elegantly. "Let's take a look at what your father is up to." In the office, Ambrose sat up straight, turning on the computer and pretending to work on the company documents. He knew Sabrina's heels were getting closer and closer. His heart was racing, but his mind was clear. For the first time in weeks, he felt he had control over what was to come. The predator living in his house, sleeping in his bed and poisoning his family, was about to discover that her prey wasn't as defenseless as she seemed. The Lockwood Mansion's library had always been Beatrice's favorite refuge. The dark mahogany shelves reached the ceiling, loaded with ancient leather-bound books, their gilded spines gleaming under the light filtered through the French lace curtains. The golden morning sunlight created delicate patterns on the shelves, dancing gently over the polished furniture. A welcoming aroma of aged paper, wood wax, and fresh flowers came from a porcelain vase on the side table. For decades, this space had been a symbol of tranquility. Now, however, it carried a somber weight, as if the walls could sense the secrets and threats that filled the house. Beatrice was seated in her favorite armchair, upholstered in deep blue velvet, her trembling hands slowly turning the pages of an old photo album. The pages were yellowed with age, but the images still preserved happy moments. Ambrose at his graduation, her wedding with Fernando, the family's first trips. Her frail fingers traced the photographs, as if trying to grasp the fragments of a past that seemed so distant. Her eyes, usually filled with sweetness, were now dull with fear, and every movement seemed laden with effort. Ambrose observed his mother from the entrance of the library for a few moments in silence. His heart ached to see her so different. The matriarch, who had always been the family's fortress, now seemed a shadow of herself, her shoulders hunched, her face more aged, and her eyes constantly fearful. After the conversation with Nora the previous night and the disturbing discoveries in his office, every small gesture from his mother was like a silent cry for the truth he had been too blind to see. The sound of Ambrose's shoes against the waxed wooden floor echoed softly as he approached. The library seemed to absorb every noise, intensifying the sense of isolation. He stopped beside the armchair, leaning in slightly to look at the album. One specific photo caught his attention, he still young next to his parents, all smiling at his graduation. A complete family, oblivious to the future. Ambrose felt a lump tightening in his throat as he realized how that moment encapsulated an innocence that now seemed so distant. "Mom," he called softly, his voice hesitant so as not to startle her. But still, Beatrice flinched. Her eyes widened in terror before recognizing her son, and that reaction was like a stab to Ambrose's heart. He crouched down to be at her level, sitting on the stool at the feet of the armchair, a gesture he had made for decades to hear the stories his mother used to tell. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out low, but laden with emotion. He held his mother's hands between his, feeling the fragility of the thin skin and delicate bones. Beatrice looked at him, tears beginning to silently roll down her wrinkled cheeks. The silence that followed seemed to weigh tons as Ambrose waited. "She said," Beatrice began, her voice a broken whisper. Her eyes drifted to the album as if unable to look at him. "She said no one would believe me, that I would be institutionalized, that you would never accept that your perfect wife." Her voice failed, swallowed by tears, and she brought her hands to her face in despair. Decades of dignity had been reduced to a constant struggle against fear. Ambrose squeezed his mother's hands tighter, the firm grip contrasting with the gentleness of his expression. "Tell me everything, Mom," he insisted, his voice now stronger but still gentle. "Every detail, every threat, every moment of fear you suffered while I was blind to what was happening in this house." His determination was unwavering, and Beatrice realized that, for the first time in a long time, perhaps she was not alone. The words began to pour out like a stream from a broken dam. Beatrice told of the daily humiliations she suffered at Sabrina's hands, the constant threats of being sent to a nursing home, the medications she was forced to take. She spoke of how Sabrina manipulated Evangeline, turning her granddaughter into an extension of her own cruelty. "She's teaching the girl horrible things, Ambrose," she said, her voice trembling. "Things a child should never learn." She said she knows places," Beatrice continued, her hands gripping Ambrose's with unexpected strength. "Terrible places. Nursing homes where people disappear, where no one hears the screams." Her words were laden with genuine terror, and Ambrose felt the weight of the revelations crush him. His heart raced, anger growing with every confession. When Beatrice mentioned Graham, Ambrose's best friend, he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. "I know, Mom," he said finally, his voice heavy with profound pain. "I know about them, about the plan, about everything." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "The dinner tonight, they plan." But the words died in his throat. How could he explain to his mother that her daughter-in-law planned to end her life? It was then that the almost imperceptible sound of fabric brushing against wood caught both their attention. Beatrice froze, her breath caught in her chest. Ambrose turned slowly, his eyes falling on the figure of Sabrina, partially hidden behind a bookshelf. The navy blue dress she wore was slightly disheveled, a detail that revealed she had been there long enough to hear more than she should have. Her face, usually a mask of perfection and control, showed a crack for the first time. Beatrice's eyes filled with terror, and she shrank into the armchair as if she wished to disappear. But Ambrose did not move. His eyes met Sabrina's with a hardness she had never seen. The tension in the air was almost tangible, and the silence that followed seemed to drag on for minutes. "Dear," Sabrina began, her voice still attempting to maintain the sweetness she always used to manipulate him, "your mother has been so confused lately. You know how she has been imagining things." But her words died as she saw the expression on Ambrose's face. For the first time in 20 years, Sabrina Lockwood felt fear. The sound of light, small footsteps in the hallway broke the tension. Evangeline appeared at the library door, dressed in a white lace dress with her dark curls tied back with a ribbon. Her eyes assessed the scene with a curiosity that seemed beyond her age. "Mommy," she called, her voice sweet and laced with a disguised venom. "Uncle Graham is on the phone. He said it's about the special dinner tonight." Ambrose rose slowly, placing himself between his mother and Sabrina like a shield. His stance was firm, unwavering. "Yes," he said, his voice grave and laden with dark meaning. His eyes never left Sabrina's. "We're going to have a very special night. Isn't that right, dear?" The afternoon advanced over the Lockwood mansion like a traitorous shadow, filling the corridors with an unsettling silence. The small storage room adjacent to the office was cramped and stuffy, with boxes haphazardly stacked and the scent of old wood permeating the air. Ambrose was hidden there, motionless, his body tense against the wooden wall as he peeked through a crack. His view of the office was partial, but enough. He could see Sabrina and Graham entering the room, their figures outlined by the golden light that streamed through the stained glass. Ambrose's phone, strategically positioned under a pile of documents on the desk, was recording every word. The cramped space where he was felt suffocating, the air heavy with the smell of ink and old paper, mixed with the distant aroma of cognac. But the tension in Ambrose's chest was even more oppressive. His heart beat like a drum, each pulse echoing in his ears as he listened to the dialogue that was about to expose the truth. Sabrina entered the office first, her delicate but firm hands adjusting the red dress that hugged her body like a second skin. The sound of her high heels marked a determined rhythm against the wooden floor, echoing through the room like a warning of her dominant presence. Her dark hair was perfectly groomed, falling over her shoulders with a luster that contrasted with the malice emanating from her eyes. She looked like a macabre queen, ruling her realm of deception with calculated elegance. Graham followed shortly after, with his usual air of sophistication that Ambrose now saw as a mask of falsity. The tailored Italian suit molded his body to perfection, and he carried a leather briefcase that Ambrose immediately recognized as the container of the company's most important documents. The golden gleam of Graham's watch shone with the movement of his arm, each reflection bringing to mind the gift Ambrose had given him on his last birthday, a gesture of friendship that now seemed a cruel joke. The sunlight, streaming through the stained glass and painting the office with colorful patterns, fell directly on Sabrina's face, enhancing her beauty in an almost diabolical way. She poured herself a glass of the cognac, reserved for special occasions, the same one Ambrose had received as a gift from Graham last Christmas. The sound of the liquid falling into the crystal glass rang out loudly in the silence of the room. "Doctor, Garcia called early this morning," said Sabrina, her voice low but laden with satisfaction. She swirled the glass in her hands as she spoke, the amber liquid reflecting the light. "The old doctor agreed to certify your mother's dementia. Within a week she'll be committed." Sabrina brought the glass to her lips, savoring the cognac before adding, "He knows a perfect place, far away from here, where no one will question if a patient disappears." Ambrose felt his body freeze. Every word that came out of his wife's mouth was like a stab wound. He watched through the crack as her smile reflected in the crystal glass, an expression of pure cruelty he had never seen before. The sound of the ice clinking in the glass was almost hypnotic, a prelude to the destruction she was orchestrating. Graham poured himself a drink as well, filling the silence with the same subtle sound of cognac falling into the glass. He seemed more tense, nervously fiddling with the knot of his silk tie, another gift from Ambrose now seen as a symbol of betrayal. "Is the documentation ready?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "We need to make sure everything looks natural." Sabrina approached Graham, her movements smooth and graceful but fraught with intent. "All prepared," she replied, placing one of her hands on his shoulder. "The medical reports, testimonies from the employees. So even that idiot Nora will confirm that the old woman is confused. She'll do anything to protect her miserable little family." Her crystalline laugh sounded like shattering glass, filling the office with a disturbing dissonance. In the storage room, Ambrose clenched his fist so tightly he felt his nails digging into his palms. The rage and hatred bubbling inside him were something new, a raw emotion that threatened to consume his sanity. 20 years of marriage, a lifetime of friendship with Graham, reduced to a conspiracy against his own mother. "And Ambrose?" asked Graham, his voice betraying a note of concern. He was tense, his eyes avoiding Sabrina's. "He's been different since yesterday, more observant. Do you think he suspects anything?" Sabrina responded with a smile that made Ambrose's stomach churn. "I have something special prepared for him," she said, her fingers toying with the rim of the glass. "That poison we got, it's really a masterpiece. Undetectable, fast, and best of all, it perfectly mimics a heart attack." The sound of light footsteps in the hallway made everyone freeze. In the small storage room, Ambrose held his breath, fearing being discovered. But to his relief and horror, it was only Evangeline, passing by with her favorite doll. The girl stopped at the door, her dark eyes analyzing the scene with a curiosity beyond her age. "Ah, darling," Sabrina called, her voice taking on a sweet maternal tone that Ambrose now knew to be completely false. "Come here. Uncle Graham and I are planning a very special surprise for Daddy." The way she emphasized special made Ambrose shudder. Evangeline entered the office, carrying the doll with the rehearsed grace of a little society lady. "Is it about tonight's dinner, Mummy?" she asked, her childlike voice laced with malice. "The one that will make Daddy sleep forever?" The pride on Sabrina's face as she heard those words was grotesque. "Exactly, my love," she replied, bending down to caress her daughter's hair. "And then when Grandma goes to that special place, it will be just the three of us. You, me, and Uncle Graham." She cast a meaningful glance at Graham, who responded with a tense smile. In the storage room, Ambrose checked his phone again, confirming that every word was being recorded. The anger he had initially felt had transformed into something cold and calculating. He knew he could not act impulsively. The man who was hiding in that storage room was no longer the same one who had entered. Naivety had died, giving way to relentless determination. Graham consulted his gold watch, the same gift from Ambrose, before rising. "I have to go," he said, finishing his drink in one gulp. "I need to prepare the bank transfer documents. After everything happens, we'll need to act quickly." He leaned in to kiss Sabrina, a gesture that seemed a profanation in the environment where so many Lockwood family memories had been built. "Don't worry," Sabrina replied, her smile now bordering on the sadistic. "In 24 hours, Ambrose will be gone, the old lady will be institutionalized, and we will be free and rich." She raised her glass in a macabre toast to the destruction of the Lockwood family. Night fell over the Lockwood mansion like a curtain of black velvet, enveloping everything in a heavy, threatening silence. Ambrose parked his car 2 blocks away, leaving the engine off for a few moments as he gathered courage. The special dinner was scheduled for 9 o'clock, but something in his instinct, or perhaps in his latest discoveries, compelled him to return early. The phone in his pocket, carrying the incriminating recordings, seemed to burn like a constant warning that the night would mark a breaking point in his life. Walking along the quiet streets leading to the mansion, Ambrose felt the gravity of the situation weighing on his shoulders. The cool night air, imbued with the scent of jasmine escaping from some neighboring garden, seemed inadequate in the face of the chaos unfolding within his mind. He stopped within sight of the mansion, observing it for a moment. The lights upstairs were on, casting elongated, distorted shadows through the windows. His attention focused on the master bedroom, where he saw Sabrina's silhouette moving slowly. That feline grace that had once enchanted him now seemed a warning of something much darker. Ambrose entered through the back door using the key he always carried. The familiar scent of the mansion's interior, a mixture of wood wax, Nora's perfume, and something he couldn't identify, greeted him like an omen. The corridors were silent, but the family portraits adorning the walls seemed to watch him, their frozen expressions laden with judgments only he could feel. Each photograph of his wedding, each image that bore witness to a happiness now undone, was a cruel reminder of the charade Sabrina had constructed. He had barely taken a few steps when he heard it. Sabrina's voice echoed down the upstairs hallway, distinct and controlled, but laden with a coldness that made his heart race. Ambrose approached the stairs silently, moving like a ghost. His body was tense, muscles ready to react at any moment, while his mind struggled to process what he was about to hear. "Yes, everything is prepared," said Sabrina. Her melodious voice seemed even more sinister in that calculating tone. "I've already put the poison in his glass. In a day he'll be dead. The doctor assured me it will look like a heart attack." She paused, and then her laughter echoed down the hallway, soft and disturbing, like the sound of breaking crystal. "No, dear, no one will suspect. Poor Ambrose, so stressed from work." Ambrose felt his legs weaken, as if the ground beneath him were crumbling. Suspicion was one thing. Hearing his wife's confession was something else entirely. 20 years of marriage, of trust, now transformed into a death sentence pronounced with the casualness of one discussing trivialities. He gripped the stair railing, the cold metal biting into his fingers as his body refused to move. "The special glass is already set aside," Sabrina continued, now with an almost intimate tone, as if sharing a secret with a lover. "That one with the gold details he likes so much. One last gift for my beloved husband." The sarcasm in her voice was cruel, almost cynical. "And then, my love, we will be free, rich, and we can finally be together." Ambrose clenched his fists as his mind reeled. The golden glass. He vividly remembered the day Sabrina had gifted it to him, insisting he use it on all special occasions. Now that gesture of affection was revealed as a piece of her calculated plot. He felt his stomach churn at the irony of the situation. "Graham, my love," she continued, her voice almost a purr, "after tonight's dinner everything will be resolved. The life insurance, the company, it will all be ours. And that meddling old woman, Dr. Garcia, has already prepared the commitment papers. No one will believe the stories of a senile old lady." Sabrina laughed again, and each note of her laughter was like a blow to Ambrose. Before he could react, he heard light footsteps in the hallway. For a moment he thought his presence had been discovered, but the footsteps were coming from the opposite direction. He turned slowly and saw Evangeline. The girl was at the end of the hallway, dressed in a white silk nightgown, her dark hair loose over her shoulders. The dim lamplight gave her an ethereal, almost ghostly appearance, but it was the look in the girl's dark eyes that captured Ambrose's attention. There was something wrong with that look, an understanding that should not have been there, a cruelty that did not match her age. "Daddy," Evangeline's voice cut through the silence like a blade. It was sweet, but there was a note of alarm that made Ambrose's blood run cold. Upstairs, Sabrina's voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Ambrose could hear the sound of his own heartbeat, the echo of Sabrina's heels approaching, and the soft rustle of Evangeline's silk nightgown against the marble floor. He realized the moment of truth had arrived sooner than he had planned. "Evangeline, darling," Sabrina called from the top of the stairs. Her voice tried to keep a maternal tone, but there was a perceptible tension. "What is it? Who are you talking to?" Her heels began to descend, each strike on the marble resonating like a countdown. Ambrose looked at his daughter, searching for a spark of innocence, something that could convince him she was still the girl he loved. But all he saw was a smile. Not the sweet smile of a child, but something calculated, almost satisfied. Evangeline tilted her head slightly as if savoring the moment. "Mom?" she called, her voice laced with a malice Ambrose had never noticed before. "I think Daddy arrived early for his surprise." The Lockwood Mansion's dining room gleamed like a jewel under the brilliance of the enormous baccarat crystal chandelier. Candles arranged in silver candelabras cast dancing shadows across the beige silk-covered walls, while the light reflected off the chandelier created sparkling patterns on the table. The French porcelain, with meticulously hand-painted gold rims, was impeccably laid out, along with silver flatware polished to a mirror-like sheen. Along the center of the table, arrangements of red roses, Sabrina's favorites, were strategically positioned, their vibrant petals contrasting with the white linen tablecloth. The sweet, heady scent of the flowers mingled with the subtle aroma of food arriving from the kitchen, creating an atmosphere of luxury and opulence. Ambrose entered the dining room slowly, observing every detail with care. Each napkin fold, each silver gleam, each shadow seemed part of a carefully orchestrated scene. And it was. He knew this dinner was not just a celebration, it was a stage, a theater for the final act Sabrina and Graham had planned. He let his gaze linger on his wife, who oversaw the last adjustments with an almost hypnotic grace. Sabrina was stunning. Her black dress hugged her curves like a work of art, and her raven hair, pulled into a chic updo, accentuated the perfection of her long neck. She glided around the table with calculated movements, like a dancer commanding her space. Her long, well-manicured fingers lightly grazed the rims of the crystal goblets, adjusting their positions. Ambrose watched as she passed by the gilded goblet, his favorite, and repositioned it with special care before his designated seat. The glint in her eyes was a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. Nora entered the dining room, supporting Beatrice, who looked even frailer than usual. The matriarch's face was pale, and her halting steps betrayed the toll of the earlier confrontation in the library. She seemed to be struggling to maintain her dignity, but Ambrose saw the shadow of fear in her eyes. Sabrina moved quickly to her, assuming her role as the perfect daughter-in-law. "Mother, I'm so glad you could join us," she exclaimed with rehearsed sweetness. Her smile appeared welcoming, but Ambrose knew it was a facade. "This dinner wouldn't be the same without you." Beatrice forced a smile, sitting down with difficulty as Nora adjusted her chair. The housekeeper exchanged a brief look with Ambrose, a look that spoke volumes. She knew what was coming. Her hands trembled slightly as she fussed with Beatrice's napkin, trying to appear natural under Sabrina's piercing gaze. Graham entered next, impeccable in a charcoal grey suit that seemed tailored just for him. His woodsy cologne preceded his arrival, filling the room with a presence as controlled as he was. He smiled warmly as he spotted Ambrose, striding forward with arms open wide. "Ambrose, my friend," he said, embracing him with excessive force. "What a special night, eh?" His tone was convivial, but Ambrose felt the chill in the hollowness of his words. "The night promises to be unforgettable," Ambrose responded, his voice neutral but weighted with meaning. He watched as Graham took his seat beside Sabrina, their eyes meeting for a moment they tried to mask, but which did not go unnoticed. Ambrose caught the conspiratorial glance, that brief display of intimacy which betrayed their intentions. He felt his chest tighten, but he remained composed. It was essential. Evangeline was the last to enter, wearing a party dress that made her look like a porcelain doll. Her raven curls bounced as she scampered to her chair, her eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and something darker. "Daddy," she called in her sweet voice, but Ambrose detected the undertone of malice she had inherited from her mother. "Mommy said tonight is going to be unforgettable." The smile she gave him was only innocent on the surface. As the dishes were served, Ambrose kept up casual conversation with Graham. They spoke of business, the latest company decisions, but every word was layered with subtext. Ambrose could not ignore the fact that his best friend was plotting his demise with the same nonchalance as he discussed profits and contracts. Nora poured the red wine, a Cabernet Sauvignon hand-picked by Sabrina with trembling hands. Her eyes met Ambrose's briefly, and he responded with an almost imperceptible nod. They were players in the same game, and she knew it. When Nora left the room, Ambrose saw his opportunity. Pretending to drop the napkin, he quickly bent down and swapped his golden goblet with Sabrina's. The movement was swift and discreet, imperceptible to everyone at the table. When he stood up, he found his wife's eyes, which watched him with an enigmatic smile. Sabrina rose gracefully, her elegant figure highlighted by the black dress, raising her goblet, the same one originally meant for Ambrose. The golden crystal sparkled under the chandelier light like a deadly jewel. "Dear ones," she began, her melodious voice filling the room with false sweetness, "I would like to make a very special toast tonight." Her eyes met Ambrose's, shining with a malign anticipation that only he could now recognize. "To my beloved husband, the most wonderful man in the world. Ambrose, my love, these 20 years by your side have been like a dream. You have given me everything, a life of luxury, a wonderful daughter, a family." She paused dramatically, smiling at Beatrice, "A mother-in-law who is like a true mother to me." Her voice trembled slightly with theatrical emotion. "You have always been so dedicated, so confident, so gullible in your love for me. Tonight is special, my dear. I have prepared everything with such care. Every detail, every moment has been thought out especially for you." Her fingers caressed the edge of the golden goblet with a disturbing intimacy. "So raise your glasses, all of you. Let us toast to my Ambrose, to our eternal love, to our union that will be unforgettable. May this night mark the beginning of a new phase in our lives, to our family, forever." Ambrose raised his glass in response, keeping his gaze fixed on her. Beatrice, seated beside him, gripped Nora's arm tightly. Her eyes were wide, full of fear and anticipation. Graham grinned broadly, already savoring what he believed to be his victory. Evangeline, as always, watched with morbid curiosity, her eyes gleaming as she absorbed every detail of the scene. "To our family," Sabrina continued, looking directly at Ambrose. "To our love, eternal." The irony in her words was so palpable that Ambrose almost laughed. She brought the glass to her lips and took a long sip, her movements as elegant as ever. For a moment everything fell silent. The room, so full of tension, seemed to have stopped in time. Then Sabrina blinked, confused. Her hand rose to her throat as her eyes widened in horrified comprehension. The golden goblet slipped from her fingers, falling to the marble floor and shattering into dozens of pieces. The sound echoed like thunder through the room. "Mommy!" Evangeline's voice cut through the silence, laden with true fear for the first time. "Mommy!" The girl rose, running to her mother, who staggered backwards. Her face was rapidly losing color, and the usual brightness of her eyes was fading. She leaned against the table, Nora's arrangements trembling with the impact. A few petals fell onto the white tablecloth, looking like bloodstains against the impeccable linen. "What? What did you do?" Sabrina gasped, her voice failing. Her gaze met Ambrose's, and in it was horror, anger, and a belated plea. Graham stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair as he rushed to hold her. Ambrose remained seated, his relaxed posture contrasting with the tension in the air. For 20 years he had been the naive husband, the loving man who did not see through his wife's facade. Now it was she who could not read the calculated coldness in his eyes. "I merely swapped the glasses, my dear." His voice came out soft, almost gentle, but laden with a glacial force that made everyone at the table shudder. "You know, as you were making your beautiful speech about our love, about trust and dedication, I was thinking about how you have always been, so meticulous in your plans." He swirled his glass slowly, watching the wine dance against the crystal. "It is truly a pity that your attention to detail failed you today of all days. I thought you might enjoy sampling the special gift you so lovingly prepared for me." His eyes met hers, and for the first time in 20 years, Sabrina saw the true man behind the facade of the devoted husband. "You were right about one thing," he continued, rising slowly, his presence dominating the dining room. "Tonight will indeed mark the beginning of a new phase in our lives, though perhaps not quite as you planned." He raised his glass in a final toast, a cold smile playing on his lips. "So, my love, a toast to our love, eternal." After all, you always said that death would not part us, did you not? Hours later, San Angel Hospital, with its sterile corridors and fluorescent lights, seemed even colder and more impersonal the following morning. Ambrose was standing in the hallway of the 4th floor, near the intensive care ward, where Sabrina was struggling against the effects of the poison she had prepared herself. The white light from the lamps reflected off the polished floor, creating an almost clinical glare that contrasted with the darkness of Ambrose's thoughts. He wore an impeccably tailored dark grey suit, but the deep shadows under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. Every second that ticked by seemed to drag, marked only by the monotonous beeping of heart monitors in the distance. He kept his gaze fixed on one of the hallway windows, which revealed the hospital's internal courtyard, with its trees pruned into geometric shapes and empty iron benches. Despite the seeming calm, Ambrose was on high alert, every fiber of his being prepared for the confrontation he knew was coming. When the familiar sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, he turned slowly, already anticipating who was approaching. Graham was coming towards him, with the same confident posture he always displayed, but this time there was something out of place. His usually impeccable Italian suit seemed crumpled, and his blue silk tie was poorly adjusted. He seemed to have left in a hurry, and the sweat glistening on his forehead betrayed the nervousness he was trying to disguise. Ambrose remained motionless, arms crossed, watching as his former best friend approached with a forced smile. "How is she?" Graham asked, trying to maintain his usual casual tone but failing miserably. His hands wouldn't stay still, adjusting his tie obsessively. Ambrose noticed the repetitive gesture and almost felt sorry, almost. Ambrose let the silence linger for a moment, observing Graham like a predator assessing its prey. "The doctor says she'll survive," he finally replied, his voice low but firm, although perhaps with some permanent consequences. "Ironically, the poison you chose is especially efficient in causing neurological damage." He emphasized the words deliberately, like a direct blow. Graham visibly paled. He stopped fiddling with his tie, his hands falling limp at his sides. "Ambrose, he began, but his attempt to speak was cut off by a brusque gesture from Ambrose. "Spare me your explanations," Ambrose interrupted, his voice as cold as ice. He took a step forward, further closing the distance between them. "I know everything, Graham, every detail I have here." He tapped the breast pocket of his jacket where his phone was tucked. "Very interesting recordings. You and Sabrina are surprisingly detailed in discussing plans to destroy me." His expression was one of pure contempt, a stark contrast to the friendship they had once shared. The corridor around them seemed frozen in time. A nurse passed by, pushing a medication cart, the vials clinking softly, but neither Ambrose nor Graham moved until the sound faded into the distant silence. The muffled murmur of conversations in other rooms mingled with the constant beeping of machines, creating an almost surreal soundtrack for the confrontation. "Two choices, Graham," said Ambrose, slowly removing an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. His movements were deliberately calm, like a predator toying with its prey. "The first is quite simple. You sign these papers, relinquish every penny you stole from me, every property you bought with dirty money, every share of the company. You'll disappear so completely that even your shadow will forget you exist." He rubbed the envelope against Graham's face with false cordiality. "Or," his eyes darkened dangerously, "I hand over to the police not only the recordings of your murder plans, but also those interesting documents about your transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. You know, the ones you used for money laundering. And of course," he smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "there are also those forged life insurance documents. Did you really think I wouldn't notice your pathetic forgery of my signature? 20 years of friendship, and you couldn't even do that, right?" He gripped Graham's chin firmly. "Just imagine the headlines, old friend. Prestigious businessman tries to kill best friend in conspiracy with victim's wife. Your kids will have to change schools. Your ex-wife will finally have proof of the scoundrel you are. And that sick mother of yours, well, I doubt she'll survive the shock of seeing her darling son handcuffed on national news." Graham swallowed hard, sweat accumulating on his brow. He took the envelope with trembling hands as if handling something radioactive. "Ambrose, please. I can explain. It was her idea. She planned everything," he said, his voice becoming an almost desperate whisper. Ambrose let out a short, humorless laugh. Really? He took another step closer, letting Graham feel the full intensity of his gaze. Was it her idea to increase the value of my life insurance policy without my knowledge? Was she the one who forged my signature on the company documents? The anger in his voice was perfectly controlled, like a sharp blade. Or perhaps it was her who suggested using my own anniversary glass to poison me. From the nearby room, through the half-open door, Sabrina heard every word. Her once haughty and confident face was now pale and marked by suffering. She was surrounded by machines and tubes, an image of vulnerability that contrasted cruelly with the woman who had planned every detail of her ascent. The IV dripped slowly, drop by drop, as her eyes closed in resignation. "You have 1 hour," Ambrose continued, putting more weight into each word. "Sign the papers, leave the city, and maybe, just maybe, I won't hand the recordings over to the police." He took a step back, allowing Graham to breathe. "But understand this. If you try anything at all, I won't hesitate to destroy you." Graham looked at the envelope as if it were a snake about to strike. He knew his position was untenable. Every word from Ambrose was a reminder that the game was over, that the power he believed he had was now completely out of his reach. In the room, Sabrina closed